Good evening, and I welcome you to the fifth panel. It is the fourth panel of the Van Leer and the Center of the Arab Society. This panel of is the fourth in a row of evenings that dealt with the Palestinian society, and will try to untangle the complex relationship between the boundaries, gender, and identity. In the last 2 decades, the dominant academic discourse has adopted a non-essentializing approach of identity that assumes that identity is negotiable and changeable. It cannot be positioned in hierarchic, binary, or oppositional order. Identity is a multidimensional. It is usually rife with contradictions, and it is generated constantly by simultaneously processes of identification and differentiation. Our challenge in this evening is to locate the ways by which social, political, and normative boundaries are drawn, to ask where and how social and physical boundaries are being redefined and social relations rearranged. Who has the power to impose borders? Of what kind? What kind of borders? Which social categories emerge as a result of boundaries demarcations? Are those identity categories support each other or oppose each other? Or in other words, what are the relationships between citizenship, national identity, local community belongings, gender identity, and religious identities? I am sure that the experts on this podium will be able to throw light on these questions, though I am fully aware that the time constraint I impose on them will not allow them to fully satisfy our eager to know and to understand this complex relationship between boundaries, gender, and identity. The 4 panelists will talk around 15 minutes. Then we will open the discussion or question from to be asked from your side, and we allow for a short reply for the panelists again. And we will finish this evening with the movie that we promised to show you, The Children of Arna. Our first speaker will be Professor Nadim Rוחאנא, professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Tel-Aviv University, Director of MADA, the Arab Center for Applied Social Research. Nadim, please.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for Van Leer and Adil for the invitation. I'm starting this presentation like I started my last presentation last time here. I don't know why Adil invites me. I am pessimistic. I don't speak with much, I think, hope for the near future. There is some part of self-torturing in attending and talking. I believe that talking, in some sense, lots of talking was done. But in any case, I'll see what we can do. I'm going to be talking about redrawing borders and redrawing identities. And the talk is about Palestinian society, although I think that we cannot talk about Palestinian society without talking about Israeli society. So most of my talk would be really about what's happening in the dynamics between the two societies, and particularly within Israeli society. The mutual impact of the flexibility of identity and the fact that identity is constantly constructed and reconstructed, that part of the talk was spared by Hannah's introduction, so we should take that as perhaps working assumption for all of us here. I know that the other speakers would too. The thing is that there's also a mutual impact between borders and identity. The flexibility of identities and their construction are influenced to a large extent by the construction of borders. Once established, these borders bound an identity, help define it and shape it, and define some of its components and perhaps construct it anew. We have to look only around us to the Arab world, to the Arab region, and see how new identities emerged since the turn of the century, from Islamic to Arab to pan-national identity to local identity, nationalist in the sense of Watani identity within each state, and the constant attempt of reshaping that. We have to look at Europe. We can look at Europe and see how identities are being reshaped all the time. Inside Israel too, although in addition to borders, of course, there is the impact and influence of political processes, particularly in multi-ethnic states like Israel, although it doesn't define itself as such. The constitutional definition of the state and the state policy has a lot to do with whether identities become a source of conflict, as they are in Israel, because Israel insists that there is one identity that's dominant, or whether they become a source of mutual enrichment. Also, we can look at the world. I can give many examples. Look, for example, at the Jews in the United States versus the Jews here. In any case, one of the processes that is profoundly influential in building identity is the process of nation building. Nation building is a process at the center of which is national identity, accentuating it, mobilizing it, using it as to continue struggle, whatever the struggle is. The struggle can be a struggle of liberation, the struggle can be a struggle of minority against oppression, and so on. What is the relationship between national building or nation building and accentuating of identity and this engagement or disengagement that's taking place here? My main argument here, or one of my main arguments here, is that the disengagement process have to do in the Israeli society with the continuation of a process of nation building. I cannot look at the disengagement as a process of peace building or as part of the process of peace. I look at it as continuation of the Zionist project of establishing a dominant, forceful Jewish state. That disengagement is more about nation building than about peace building or peacemaking. You have only to look at the policies and at the discourse. There is no discourse of peace in the disengagement. There is not a talk about, it's not an outcome of mutual negotiation between partners or parties. It's not about returning to Palestinians their occupied land. There's no understanding of the national aspirations of the Palestinians in the disengagement. There's no understanding of the refugees. There is absence, complete absence. Even when we look at the TV and we see the suffering and tormentation of a Jewish person leaving her home or his home, and the tree outside her home and his home. And when she says, I had this tree growing up for 20 years or 30 years, for 7,500 settlers, for every single settler, that must be a trauma. It was a trauma for a whole nation without being compensated and without being recognized for what they suffered. There is no talk about that. There is no living, there is no talking about two neighboring states and living of two neighboring states. There is no building together a joint future. There is no compromise on the buildings within the settlements and thinking about them as partial, perhaps, compensation for a nation that has been expelled and occupied. If I'm wrong, tell me that there is a discourse that I'm missing here. Together with that, of course, there are the policies that are consistent with this discourse. The policies, the language of force, violence, and threats, and domination, and there are the policies that are consistent of destruction of houses, of areas. There is the of elimination of people, of expropriation of land, and continuous expansion as we look around Jerusalem, around us here. This is the same language of Zionism all over again. It's a new phase of establishing, perpetuating, imprinting, and enforcing the Jewish state. It's nation building. This is Jewish nation building, of course, when we talk about nation building in Israel. It goes without saying that we are talking about Jewish nation building. This is to maintain and reinforce the Jewish state. This is not disengagement in order to build better citizenship in Israel between Arab and Jew. It's not in order to reinforce democracy in Israel. It's not in order to build an inclusive Israeli identity. It's disengagement in order to strengthen the Jewish identity, to develop, and here you can think about the impact on the Palestinians in Israel, because other people might refer to other parts of the Palestinian people. It's strengthening the Jewish identity and development of the Naqab, the Negev, and Galilee. When we know what development stands for, it's just because they don't want to use the word Jewidization. It's giving incentives every day almost to Jewish settlements around Gaza and priority areas. In my conversations with the human rights people, they cannot deal with the new laws and regulations going to the Supreme Court. It's constitutionalizing Israel as a Jewish state, as I'll mention later in a minute. It's the citizenship law that for the first time human rights organizations here and around the world call a racist law being passed without much self-criticism. It's the imposition and employment of ethnic policies that are becoming more openly ethnic. It's reinforcing an already unjust system, taking it to the extreme. Hannah Arendt teaches us that reaction to an injustice is outrage and anger. But there's one thing that outrages us more than injustice, and that's hypocrisy. It's not only reinforcing the Jewish state, it's also imposing on its Arab citizens that they have to accept it as Jewish and democratic. It's the project of Jewish and democratic state, of nation building and image building. It's a project that is self-serving in its deception for the Jewish majority, and I'll say how and why. It's a project in which the Israeli academia, to which I had the honor, or I have the honor until now, to be on collegiality with many of the exceptions to the people I'm talking about. The Israeli academia had as its project for 20 years to resolve the internal contradictions between Jewish state and identity on the surface, on theorizing, instead of dealing with realities on the ground. It's a process in which academia spent lots of efforts, senior academics, leading academics, to justify it, rationalize it, theorize for it, instead of challenging it, criticizing it, and talking about the reality. It's a project that Israel has been involved in for the last 20 years in academia, the constitutional effort that in the recent few years was seeking the consent of the Arabs to agree that Israel is Jewish and democratic by any means. It's a process in which the judiciary is involved, where the Supreme Court openly balances two values, Jewish versus democratic, and says, well, Jewish privilege should take precedence, it's a process in which it's a diplomatic process too, in which diplomatically Israel is trying to impose that on the world. In any case, it's a process of self-deception in which I will skip the privileges that are given, in which the majority finds itself in that project, in maintaining and perpetuating that project. What will happen when Israel withdraws, disengages in the short time that I have here to encapsulate the remainders of my arguments? What will happen when Israel withdraws or disengages is that it will insist on its Jewish identity. We gave the Arabs part of our land. We made concessions. Now this is our state, our only state. And as such, the privilege of the Jew over Arab will be perpetuated. And I think this will be perpetuated and can be perpetuated in a system that can be defined only as a tyranny of the majority. Of course, it's a democratic system in the sense that there is voting, and there is voting in the Knesset. But the votes of every single law that I examined in the last 3 years or so that limits the rights of the Arabs is by majority of Jews. This is ethnic tyranny. It's done. Of course, we will say that it's different than apartheid. There is nobody in his right or her right mind that will say that Israel with its ethnic tyranny is like the apartheid. But I think that there is a similarity that we should consider. And the similarity that we should consider is the ethnic tyranny. The ethnic tyranny in the apartheid is the tyranny of the minority. And the ethnic tyranny in Israel is the tyranny of the majority. This is an imposition by force and when needed by violence against the Arab citizens of a tyranny that uses the formalities of democracy. So what will happen is that there will be a division between privileged and underprivileged, between those who have the privilege and maintain it, and between those who are underprivileged. And so these underprivileged will not only be the Arabs in Israel. These underprivileged will also be the Arabs, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And the division that was in Israel between Jew and non-Jew is turning around a new identity of underprivileged that is the Palestinian all over Palestine, from the river to the sea, and the privileged who is the non-Arab, whether Jewish or non-Jewish. And I think that the configuration of the new identity or the new identities will be along these lines. I think we should be aware of that. I think that the conflict would be defined around that. And I think that new strategies for how to deal with this conflict, how to envision its resolution, and how to work towards its resolution should be around these identities. Thank you.
Professor Salim Tmari is the second speaker, director of Institute of Jerusalem Studies. He is professor of sociology at Birstate, editor of the Jerusalem Quarterly, and many other publications that I reserve myself to tell them because I didn't do it for the first speaker, so I apologize for all of you, and we'll look for the list of publication on the internet or other places. Salim.
Thank you, Hannah, for your introduction. Many thanks to Professor Adel Manna and to the Van Leer Institute to bring me all the way from the heights, the mountains of Ramallah to the hills of Jerusalem. It's a privilege to be with you tonight. I want to engage you with a discussion along the lines that Nadim Rוחאנא raised, although perhaps not from the same perspective, or maybe not necessarily from the same conclusions. Obviously, it's not a situation which lends itself to optimistic scenarios, but I think one should not be a prisoner of the moment, especially when we talk about the politics of identity. My main work in the last 3 years have been I have been escaping backwards to the Ottoman period, which is very relieving when you have to read the daily press, is to go back when things were probably horrible, but at least 100 years later they sound tolerable. And one thing that strikes me about examining the shifting attributes of identity in this region is how ephemeral it is. Within the last 100 years, we can say that at least the peoples of Palestine have gone through at least 5 clearly delineated or not so clearly delineated identities, from Ottoman to Greater Syrian to Southern Syrian to Palestinian nationalist to amorphous Jordanian identity. On the Jewish side, you also have the Ottoman identity. You have a latent Greater Syrian identity among the Levantine Jews, to a Hebrew nationalist identity, to a qualified Israeli identity separate from the Jewish identity, and so on. So in 100 years, which is not long time, I mean, in our ages, it's long, I hope, but in terms of historical analysis, it's a compact period. And if we look 10 or 15 years now, we will be able to reflect on the present perhaps with a bit more somber or maybe a bit more joyful analysis, I hope. I was asked to address the issue of disengagement, how it affects current identity and current vision about the present and the future. One thing about disengagement is that it has elicited very little enthusiasm among the Palestinians. There's a lot of debate within Israel, but very little among the Palestinians. Within elite circles, there is a lot of discussion about the concrete consequences of the disengagement, especially in terms of the security vacuum that it will raise. But there is a feeling very much along the lines described by Nadim Rוחאנא that it is an Israeli game and that its objective is not the beginning of a process of disengagement between Israel and the Palestinians, but a redefinition of Israeli military presence in Palestine in toto and partial relocation of the settlers to the occupied territories. And that's why people are very ambivalent about it. You will not find many people opposed to the disengagement among the Palestinians in the same manner that you do in Israel, but you will not find people saying, it's the first step for another type of engagement. That is not the situation we have, for obvious reasons. But it does usher a new rupture in our perception of reality. It does lead us to see the accumulation of a new epoch, a new era in defining the territorial solution between Israel and the Palestinians. And that, in my view, is very interesting. Until last year, there was a residual feeling that the process which began in Madrid in 1990-91 was a process that went in 2 different directions. One, explained by the negotiations that took place in Washington under the leadership of, on the Palestinian side, of Haidar al-Shafi, which thought in terms of a package deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and another one which was led by the current Prime Minister, Ahmed Kureya Abu Ala, which saw the devolution of Israeli control and the historic reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis in terms of a gradual, cumulative process spelled out in the Oslo Treaty. And the collapse of the Oslo Agreement, for a variety of reasons that I will not have time to go to, but I'm sure you are familiar with, although it's contested on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side, was actually a collapse of the territorial principle. Because the remaining part of Oslo is not an alternative to the gradualism. It's not a return to a package deal. It's not a return to final status negotiations, but something else. And that something else one can only read in the hidden agendas of the disengagement. But within this hidden agenda, there definitely one does not see a package deal based on the principle of two states, delineated boundaries, us and them, peace based on two sovereignties, etc. Rather, at best, it's a sovereignty and a half. And that is the reason, I believe, that the collapse of the Oslo at the beginning of this engagement has created a system of territorial control, spatial allocation, that the nearest thing to define it, sorry to say, is something very similar to the apartheid system in South Africa. And I say this with caution. I'm trained as a social scientist. I do not use words in a very wanton way. But it does have all the elements of apartheid. In some respects, it's better. In some respects, it's worse than the apartheid system. It's not exactly the same. It has the specificity of our situation. But it has these features. It has a feature of spatial control by ethnicity. It has the pass system by categories of citizenship. There are 5 or 6 categories, depending whether you are from Gaza, the West Bank, Israeli Jew, Israeli Arab, Russian Gentile, guest worker. It has a system of categories by juridical status, which allows people to move, seek employment, reside, have access to services, have access to wealth, and so on, which defines you by your ethnicity and by your cultural background. So that, again, is a cornerstone of the system that prevailed in South Africa before independence. And thirdly, it's a totalitarian system in the manner in which criminologists, I think is the word, used to refer to a system which penetrates every seam of people's social life and regulates them through control mechanisms, through allocation of residence by juridical status, and through zoning, which has reached its highest expression, of course, in the building of the physical wall of separation and the checkpoints. And I say this not only from the point of view of people who are living on this side of the wall, who are controlled not to enter Israel, but to move from one urban area to another, from one village in the district to the district center, from north to south, but also in categories of access to privileges, services, and resources within Israel itself. So all of these have created a system which is a control system based on demography and categories of citizenship, and which have replaced, in a very basic way, the promise of a territorial disengagement which was embedded in the hopeful days following the first Gulf War and the Madrid Peace Conference. And the failure of Oslo spelt the death blow with the coming of the successive Likud governments and their allies to create a security apparatus based on the notion of protecting Israeli Jews and Israeli citizens from Palestinian violence, but using this fear among Israelis to regulate their lives and our lives in a manner which has permanency in it. And this permanency is the definition of the current moment. Nothing is permanent, of course. We're all going to die at the end. But there is a certain categorical gelness of the situation which makes the reversion to an open society where market access, citizenship defines people's rights and privileges is no longer obtainable. And that is why I think we should, and this is what I want to end my talk with, we should not think of Palestine and Israel as two countries anymore. We cannot think of the Palestinian Authority as an alternative authority to the Israeli state. Rather, it's a system of control which delegates Israeli hegemony over the area to an agency, and I don't mean an agency which performs the role of agent, but one which administers the needs of people in favor of this totalitarian system of control. That is why I think there's one political economy for everybody. The fact that there's a wall in the middle does not diminish the nature of this oneness of the system. And it is this oneness of the system that invites a solution based on non-territorial principles. And I say this not as an advocate of a binational state. I never belonged to this category, but one that sees the new realities as imposing new political solutions. The oneness of this political economy means that we have to seek a solution where the denial of the possibility of Palestinian sovereignty, Palestinian independence, means that Israel will have in the intermediate future, certainly the long perception, have to find a solution that takes this into account. It cannot escape it. Jordan does not want to be Palestine. Greater Syria is impossible. We might be or might not be part of the European community, but we certainly are part of the same crucible. We are part of the same territorial entity called the Holy Land. And the price to be paid for the absence of Palestinian independence may also be a diluted form of the Jewish state. That is a state which becomes a state of the citizens and its potential citizens on the other side of the wall. And this means that we have to think creatively about how to transcend this situation. I will only hint, perhaps I can only hint about it at the end. First, I think we have to abandon the nationalist paradigm which creates the illusion that we live in two entities. We live in two entities, but these two entities are not two juridical situations which separate us. The wall separates us, but not this new political economy. Second, we need to think along lines which allow Palestinians and Israelis to escape the fear of each other in a transcendent legal and constitutional arrangement, whether it is by belonging to a federation or super entity that extends the borders of the State of Israel and the country of Palestine. And finally, this requires a lot of active intervention by people at the grassroots, both in Israel and Palestine. Without that, it will be an enforced situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tmari. As we see that to think about borders and identities is not only drawing lines, but much more complicated situation. And I would like now to invite Professor Dr. Wafa Darwish from Birdate University. She is Professor of English Literature.
Yeah, I think that's more convenient for me. Again, thank you very much for Hannah, for Professor Mana, and for Van Leer for giving me this opportunity. And I would like to start by saying, actually, as Hannah introduced me, I'm not a researcher in sociology or in political sciences. I'm a person of literature. And so what you will be hearing is actually more of a personal reflection on things and more of a personal perspective and outlook on things in general. I would like to reinforce again what Hannah said about the fluidity and the contingency of identities. But I would like to focus actually on the fact that, ironically, whereas among intellectual circles and among people who believe in a more general human project, identity as a fluid entity or a contingency is being discussed. What is actually happening on the ground, and particularly in this part of the world, is that we're having the opposite, actually. Identities are becoming more rigid and are becoming more so, of course, by the building up of walls and the construction of borders. And as is, I mean, identity in itself is a very complex matter, whether we are talking about national, gender, religious, or what have you of identities. As it is complex, it is also, of course, more complex in this part of the world. Therefore, I'm not going to be discussing this from a political point of view, but rather from a psychological and human point of view, as people experience their identity in everyday life, as a matter of fact, on the roads and in houses, and especially with regard to Jerusalemites in particular. I'm not pessimistic as well, and I was happy to that the session has started with someone who is not pessimistic, because I didn't want to be the only one. It's not always nice to be pessimistic, so at least somebody else shares it with me, and I feel more courageous to express as much as possible of my pessimism. And in my talk, actually, I'll be simply maybe throwing ideas and bringing up questions rather than introducing a neat, well worked out paper. On the national level, I think that everybody, of course, knows about the separation and the division, and how disunited Palestinian society is. But I thought that among the things that we should really pay attention to is the psychological impact of this disconnection. As much as Nadim and Salim tried to focus on the building up of national identities, I think in Palestine here in particular, we do have the problem of separation and division to the extent that psychologically, I know that this is going to be controversial, but psychologically, I don't know how much we are suffering in trying to become one people. Already people in Jerusalem find it very hard to reach Ramallah. Ramallah used to be my favorite city, and I'm going to be a little bit personal, it's all right. I told Hannah that part of this is going to be a personal testimony. And I do really feel a stranger now that I go to Ramallah, whenever I go there. And again, I'm not discussing this from a political level, I'm only discussing it from a mere human, psychological and social level. Families are disconnected from each other. People are tortured trying to get to their work. Growing anxiety over leaving work. I don't know how much, I know that it is in the media, but I don't know what it means to people on the personal level. To feel anxiety over leaving their work with the talk about closing up the wall. I mean, the wall hasn't closed up yet, but it's on the way to being closed. Anxieties over leaving work, anxieties over being separated from family, friends, and loved ones. And what I'm trying to say is that 38 is it years of occupation, and I'm merely talking about Jerusalem, as I said before. What has this actually done to the psyche and to the everyday coping of such a people living under so long an occupation? At another level, there is also the strange image of ourselves that is developing among ourselves. I know that also most of you heard that, but maybe for people who are working in sociology, it's worthwhile stopping and studying things that compose the image. For example, and again, I know that this might be controversial, but even when we joke with each other, and I'm only talking at the level of joking, you know, we call Palestinians from the 48 Arab Israelis. And I know that this is used sometimes to joke and sometimes otherwise, but again, it's our perception of ourselves as different. Recently, I also heard that people from Jerusalem in particular are referred to as Arab al-Fordat. You know, there's the phenomena of Fords in Jerusalem, these cars that take people around. They're usually unofficial and, well, anyways, they refer to us as Arabs of the Ford. Of course, the image of West Bank and Gaza and the reference to them as Shtachim, whatever. I mean, all this, regardless of how painful it is, how accurate or inaccurate, regardless of its scientific basis, this is what I'm trying to say, is somehow reflective of how people are really, Palestinians are really encountering complexities relating to their identities. I'm not saying that Palestinians are not aware of their national identity. All I'm saying is that the closures, the separation, the division is creating complexities that are making it hard. For people in Jerusalem in particular as well, the idea of being able to cross into both societies with relative ease, and I say relative ease because somehow we are looked upon as different, either if we are in the areas of the PNA or, of course, when we are in proper Israel. This perception of us as also being different, I think, is problematic to many people from Jerusalem. Where do we see ourselves exactly with regards to identity? I think, and I'm mostly speaking of middle class, liberal, westernized, let's put it that way, class of people who see themselves as in some kind of dilemma over where they stand exactly. And again, I don't mean as far as national identity is concerned, I mean it more in terms of psychological day-to-day living. I know people in Jerusalem who haven't been to Ramallah or to any of the other West Bank areas for years. The city itself, of course, the city of Jerusalem has also undergone serious social changes in terms of social and religious values in particular. It has become, East Jerusalem in particular, has become a very religious place where people are mostly caught up in the alternative of religion. I mean, I remember Jerusalem when I was much younger. People were definitely less religious than they are now. And this creates another level of conflict. On the one hand, they are turning into somehow serious Muslims, and on the other hand, their day-to-day life is with the somehow secular institution of the Israeli government or the Israeli institutions. So that is another level of conflict regarding another level of identity with people from Jerusalem in particular. As for the disengagement from Gaza, well, like my colleagues before, I do think that Palestinian people are confused, are ambiguous about this, and they're mostly indifferent because they don't really trust or believe that it is serious. And if it is serious, then it is not a very honest step. But I don't want to elaborate on that. But I would like to say a few words about after the disengagement, with, again, regards to psychological closures. I mean, as I said before, the borders are not completely walled in yet. I mean, we are somehow walled in, but we are not yet walled in into complete cantos. Yet you can feel in each separate entity of the Palestinian society the already done damage of course, cultural isolation, educational isolation, social isolation, which is reflecting itself actually on the cultural life of the Palestinian people, and hence maybe the withdrawal more into religious in the lack of cultural and educational interaction with the other and with the outside society and with the world at large, even with ourselves. There are cultural activities in Ramallah that even we Jerusalemites don't want to go to because we don't want to cross Kalandia. I'm sure you heard about the night fair called Kalandia. So with regard to Gaza in particular, I mean, after the disengagement, I really don't see how this strip is going to look like on the social and cultural level. I've been to Gaza once a few years back to attend a conference, and to be honest with you, I really felt claustrophobic. It's horrible to feel that you are in a closed area where you can't really get out, and if somebody decides to close the gates, you're completely locked in as if in a prison. But, well, this is mostly our situation now, wherever we are. All this, of course, leads to another social phenomena which is very important, which is the immigration of youngsters, youth in particular, especially educated youth. Nobody wants to stay, if they can, of course. And I think this is also a very serious and dangerous phenomena that the Palestinian people are facing. Facing under such horrible life. The gender issue, very quickly. Well, of course, all these burdens and problems that are faced by Palestinians in general are doubly faced by Palestinian women, because they have to face up to all these problems, plus, of course, their situation as women, which makes it very harder for them. Despite the money put in non-governmental organizations, despite everything that has been done for women, I don't think that Palestinian women are free and independent, even if they are economically independent. Because, again, with the religious impact, with the isolation, cultural and social isolation, the situation of women has not really become better. There's also a special problem facing, again, liberal westernized Palestinian women, because they have also to confront society and its ostracism practiced against them. Well, what I really hope for is that the wall that is closing up bit by bit and eating us up culturally and socially will not finally be closed up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Darwish. And thank you especially for me for bringing up the everyday experience, which is my conception, the feminist perspective, because the personal is political. And now I would like to invite Dr. Dani Rabinowitz from Tel-Aviv University. He is an anthropologist and expert in Palestinian society. Please, Dani.
Well, it's a while since panels like this and meetings like this, whether in a strictly academic context or in a more open public context like this afternoon, it's a while since these meetings have become competitions in pessimism. I don't know who's going to win this afternoon's competition, but I'll do my best. And I'll offer you some of my thoughts and remarks on these days of doom and gloom. Let me start with a word of skepticism about the framing of this very interesting discussion this afternoon. It's a skepticism about the value of debates about conjunctural events. We have a conjunctural event which is coming up upon us, disengagement, something that, as Salim said quite rightly, is really very, very relevant and very, very exciting for Israelis and almost a non-event for Palestinians. Now, if we assume that identity forming and negotiation of identity is related to conjunctural events, then we could have these discussions periodically. And I must say that such discussions are part of our lives, both in academia and outside of it. Discussions about big issues that emanate from situations on the ground. And of course, this logic would be supported if we do remember, as Hannah said quite rightly, that identity is now seen as a non-essential entity, is something that is open-ended, something that is negotiated, something that is open to the world, and therefore could be shaped, or at least dented, or at least impacted by events out there, including a key event like the one that is happening very soon. What I would say here is that, and I think it has to be said, that we are still very unclear, we in the social sciences, although in spite of all these developments in the way we understand identity, I think there's still much work to be done about the actual relationship between identity and key events in real life, even when these key events are really very big. We are much comfortable, for example, to make a connection between memory and identity, and how we think about past events collectively and personally. And I think we are more in the dark when it comes to a real analysis, a rigorous analysis of how events surrounding us actually affect our identity. And yet, having said all that, the disengagement is irresistible, because it will create, or so we are told, after it has happened, an entity which, again, is perhaps a little bit easier to make relevant for identity. And I'm talking about a separation, a boundary, disengagement, a situation on the ground. Now, first of all, on this account, we have to remember that the Gaza Strip has, to all intents and purposes, been already severed and separated from Israel proper and from the cognitive map of both Israelis and Palestinians for at least 15 years since the first Intifada, and probably even longer. The fact that Israel has fenced off Gaza very effectively and in meticulous loyalty to the Green Line has created a situation there which calls into question our conceptualization of this engagement as a new development on the ground. So what I'm saying here is that Gaza really has been separated for a long time, has been severed. What is probably more interesting and more relevant for this event, especially for Israelis, but I think here also for Palestinians, is that for the first time, as part of a political process or a political move by Israel, if not a political movement, we have, I wouldn't call it large scale, but on the other hand, in terms of Gaza, a total process of uprooting settlements. And I think this is what makes it a little bit more relevant and interesting in terms of the way people look at it. And I'm so far only talking about the way Israelis are looking at it. Gaza has always been an integral geographical entity. It's called a strip. It is rectangular. It has very straight lines all around it. It is discrete. It is clear. It is coherent as a geographical area. It has very clear boundaries, unlike, for example, the West Bank. The West Bank is really a literary term that doesn't have any natural borders or any understood borders. And I think that for Israelis, the disengagement from Gaza promises, and I'm talking about mainstream Israelis, the people who are still very, or at least somewhat optimistic about it, the disengagement and especially the uprooting, if you like, the evacuation of Israeli settlements represents a clean cut and a real return to the Green Line. And it's not only a clean cut return, it's a second return to the Green Line in terms of Gaza. Israel has a habit of giving Gaza back. It never liked it. It never felt that it really had very strong claims on it. Talk about Gaza first, where was the first time that the idea of returning land to the Palestinians became legitimate in the Likud by Ronnie Milo, a long time ago. It was returned, when I say it was returned, of course, I refer to 1957. So for mainstream Israel, there is a promise that the return of Gaza and evacuation, and the return of Gaza empty of Israeli settlement. So of course, in these respects, I think that there is a very strong relationship between the notion of the disengagement, if you like, the symbolic interaction that could happen around the imagination of disengagement, and a very clear sense of what Israeli identity is. And I think that Nadim made some interesting remarks about that, very forceful ones. It also tied to the belief of mainstream Israel that the disengagement from Gaza is the beginning of a long and promising and very positive peace process. The best place to find illustrations for this optimistic, I think hugely over-optimistic, completely unrealistic view is on the op-ed page of Haaretz. At least twice every day you would see mainstream publicists writing about how hopeful they are that if only this disengagement would happen, then the path is clear for peace on earth. I think, as has been said before, for the Palestinians, both inside Israel and in the West Bank, the disengagement is really a non-event. If anything, it's an oversized intra-Israeli, inside Israel event, a campaign, like an election campaign, or a song contest, or the finals of the Israeli Cup in this sport or the other. I think that following Oslo, and following the fact that Oslo really signaled for the Palestinians in the occupied territory the first militarization of the occupation. The occupation was there, of course, but it wasn't really militarized until the Oslo process. And I think the lessons and the sophistication with which Palestinians, and I'm not necessarily talking about Palestinian analysts, I'm talking about Palestinians who look at the situation from their experiential point of view. I think the sophistication with which they look at geopolitical events has been sharpened and elevated in an immense way after Oslo, because they were the first ones to really understand very quickly, already in the mid-90s, that what they had in Oslo is a militarization of the occupation. And I think this also enables the Palestinians to have a much clearer view, and I think less ideological and idealistic view of what this disengagement could or could not be. And that's why I think that the view from Palestine, if you like, of this engagement is a much more realistic one. I think I will only say one or two sentences about the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I would say that the disengagement plan and the separation war, of which I would say a few words in a moment, finds them in a very interesting and in many ways very frustrating situation. It is a situation which I would characterize as conceptual clarity, or heightened conceptual clarity, and political paralysis. I think that the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and I've made this in a number of other places in writing, and especially the younger generation, are much more clear conceptually about who they are and what their identity is. Nevertheless, this does not make them, by any stretch of the imagination, more effective political agents. So the political paralysis is very much there. The conceptual clarity of their situation and of who they are, Palestinian more than anything else, is crystallizing all the time, and I think that the events regarding the disengagement only make a contribution to this. This, by the way, I cannot say about mainstream Israelis, and I've already made that point. A political paralysis of the Israeli left and center is there, but conceptual clarity is not at all there. And this is one of the reasons why this conjectural meeting about the conjectural event, I think, is very important, because most of the audience is Israeli. If there are any winners, big winners in terms of identity formation around the conjectural events, it's the settlers. I think that what we've been seeing, the settlers and their supporters within Israel, I think what we've been seeing, and we will still see in the next few weeks, is really a God-sent event in terms of the extreme right and extreme territorial right in Israel. You can really see a revitalization of a movement and a reaffirmation of an identity that in many ways has been in a fix since Oslo, for reasons that I will not go into. But I think that for the settlers, this struggle, not so much to disengage in itself, but the actual struggle that goes on and the momentum that it has really become a focal point for a revitalized collective identity. My last point is that I think that the disengagement in Gaza hinges on the separation wall, on the building and the completion of the separation wall. And I think that for the Likud, for Sharon himself personally, but also for the government that he heads, there is a balance between the disengagement in Gaza and the building and the completion of the separation wall. I think both of them come from the same logic, a logic of fear, of forced distanciation between the two countries, the two nations, of the kind that Salim Tmari was challenging a few moments ago, from the mentality of an iron wall. But what happens in the separation wall, which is why I'm calling it a balancing out of the disengagement from Gaza, is that because the separation wall very defiantly ignores the green line, it can be shown by the relevant people in the Likud to other relevant people in the Israeli right that this is not a sellout and this is not a return to the dreaded green line of 1948. And I think in this respect, the right wing in Israel is probably more clear about the green line and about the danger of going back to the green line in its own formulation than is the Israeli left or the Israeli mainstream. I think that in both cases, the disengagement here in Gaza and the separation wall in the West Bank makes us all borderline cases, if you excuse my psychology relevance here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabinowitz. I think that in the competition of pessimism, maybe we have to thank again to Dr. Adan Mana for bringing us here and using this opportunity of this engagement to discuss and to debate about issues, especially those who were ignored in the public discourse in the Jewish population, Jewish press. And now is your part. I'm ready to get questions, comments, short comments, and then the panelists will answer. Okay.
To say that there might also be a glimpse of optimism in the very fact that we can have this meeting here this evening, because, you know, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs live in different psychological realities. This is very obvious if you take the case of a suicide bomber, which Israeli Jews call a massacre, and the Palestinian Arabs, many of them think of him as a shaheed. So the optimism is in the fact that 3 Palestinian Arabs could speak here this evening on one side of the fence, so to speak. But if an Israeli scholar were to come to Bir Zayt, I'm not sure he could speak on the other side of the fence. I'm not saying I'm on the other side, but I'm saying that the very fact that this meeting can take place is a kind of optimistic sign. Thank you very much.
The main thing which was very interesting for me was the fact that we spoke a foreign language. We spoke English. Now, not only did we speak English, but in Hebrew, we're talking about zehuyot, gvulot. And gvulot can be a border, a boundary, or a definition like Dr. Darwish's definition of something which is felt, a limitation. And each of you, excuse me, we're talking about something quite different. Because our first speaker used the word Palestinian for a long time and then went into Arab. Dr. Tmari, or Professor Tmari, sorry, when you were trying your best to talk about not states, but one country, the Holy Land, lost us and started talking about Palestinians and Israelis. Now, if this whole thing is Palestine, I'm as Palestinian as you are. Because, I mean, both of us were born before 48. I was much older. So we have a problem which we don't always want to recognize, but when we speak a foreign language, how that comes out. And with Dr. Darwish, I can only tell you one thing. For a much longer time, I haven't had coffee and cake in Ramallah, and I love Ramallah from childhood. So it is a question of how do I feel as far as identity? And yes, when I go to what is today called East Jerusalem to buy things, and by chance it is an Islamic festive time, even though I look as Jewish can be, I mean, Hitler would have put me in a concentration camp immediately. If I smoke on the street, I, the foreigner, I get sweared at. So it is true that our questions of how do we identify ourselves is part of the feeling of the day, except for one thing, and that is national identity, and Mr. Rabinowitz talked about that. His was a national identification with a certain academic tone to it. But all of us, I don't know. How do we identify ourselves?
Thank you very much.
I don't know what my identity is. I'm supposed to be Jewish. I'm Israeli. Once that meant something positive, now it means something totally negative. I don't want to talk about myself and my identity or even what the speaker spoke about. I just want to relate to the gentleman that spoke up there. One of the characteristics of Israeli identity is, above all, its hypocrisy. Its unwillingness to really look at itself. To say that we are a democracy because 3 Palestinians can talk in Jerusalem is the height for me of hypocrisy. We are not a democracy. we have trappings of democracy. But the content of democracy is not that 3 Palestinians can actually come and talk. Because nobody's going to, first of all, nobody listens to them. If anybody would really listen, if this would be a hall crowded with youngsters who are really searching for something, I'm not sure if they'd be allowed to come. As nobody listens, then we can afford to be democratic, Yani Kilo. Thank you.
I'd like someone to speak a little more specifically, if there is anything interesting to say on the topic, about the aspect of gender. Because besides just saying that women always suffer a little more, I would be interested in hearing in what respect women have a different experience than men in whatever it is that we're talking about.
When we speak about identity, of course, we think about, in this context, about national identity. I think that the disengagement has nothing to do with it. But I am afraid that those peoples who live here missed an opportunity or a number of opportunities. One of opportunity was the occupation of Palestine after in 1917. The Arabs of Palestine then had an opportunity to start building a nation. The Jews started to build a nation even before. The next opportunity to start building a Arab national entity was 48. In 48, it could be a start to building an Arab nation. But instead of thinking about parallel building of nations, building of an Arab nation, or Palestinian nation, you call it what you want, and a Jewish nation, the Arab thought that building of a Jewish nation is contrary to building of an Arab nation. And unfortunately, the Arabs did not learn, not from the 48 Nakba, and not from the 67 occupation, that the way to build an Arab nation is to do it in parallel and not in conflict with the building of the Jewish nation.
Thank you.
My question is to Professor Tmari, if you can elaborate a bit about the idea of one country, if you can expand the idea a little. Just.
My question is to
Nadim, Professor Nadim Rוחאנא?
the man in the gray.
I think that it's okay. We will allow the panelists to answer all the questions. Okay.
In your discussion, you spent time sociologically, politically, and about the border. But you didn't state if it's separated or not. I'd like to know the implication of the separation of two countries and their sociological and political.
To all of you, is there a change going on in the Palestinian identity from a nationalist type of relation to fundamentalist or Islamist, like we see people in Gaza are really afraid of, and things are moving on to the West Bank as well?
5 minutes to talk, to apply, or to say something that they missed in the 15 minutes before.
I don't think I can go over the response to all these comments. I just want to make two short comments, one about to the person who asked me a direct question, and the second one related actually to the gentleman here who asked us why do we not address issues in other parts of the Middle East. To the last part, I think the answer is very obvious. We try to address the situation we live in. The fact that there are Jews in South America or Arabs or Muslims in Darfur who are suffering is something which may resonate with our needs and sentiments, but it is not something which we put our daily concrete struggles for. We fight for our rights and privileges wherever we live. We suffer with the Lebanese, with the Sudanese, but this is our battle, is right here. The point I was trying to make is that there's a paradigm shift in the way we link politics to our identity, and that is the days in which this country can be divided in two states may be too late. And I don't say this as a threat, I just say it as an observation, that the more we intensify the building of concrete walls and make categorical separation based on citizenship, you actually make it nearer to make these physical acts of separation undermine the political process whose objective it is. And by that I mean that it is no longer possible to think of a solution to the Palestinian problem from an Israeli perspective outside Palestine, and it is possible to think of a resolution of the constitutional crisis of the State of Israel within new categories. These include multiple citizenship, staying on the same land but belonging to different citizenship, creating a supranational entity which at the same time would protect the needs and interests of Palestinians and Israelis. We have a Cypriot or a Serbo-Croatian model. It doesn't have to be the same, but along these lines. And that the tendency to actually deny people their freedom may put in jeopardy the whole project of a Jewish state. And I think this is the situation we live in today. And that the fact, it may not be a bad solution at the end for both of us. That is, we deny the possibility of the emergence of a Palestinian state, but also we deconstruct the nature of the Jewish state. And what lies beyond that is something, I'm not telling you not because I'm keeping it as secret, because I don't know where it's going, but it's something which we should unleash our imagination in that direction.
I'll respond very quickly to the person who asked why we could come and speak here and you can't go and speak on the other side of the wall. And I don't want to really contemplate whether it is optimistic or not for us to be speaking here. I mean, I don't want to discuss that. But there seems to be a problem with the Israeli people. Not all of them, of course, but most of them don't seem to see the difference between someone who is practicing injustice and someone who's been subjected to this injustice. I mean, you occupied the land, you closed the people in, you walled them up. They're living under horrible circumstances, and you expect them to be generous. I mean, there is bitterness, and nobody denies it. There is bitterness. There are hard feelings among both sides. If we are welcome in Van Leer, I don't think we are welcome in many other places as well. I mean, one has to admit that the situation is difficult, and more so among people who are really suffering the injustice and who feel that they have been done injustice towards. you do allow yourself at least to give them the borderline, the space to at least take to themselves a little bit. I would also like to say a few words about the gender issue. With regard to gender, what I meant to say was that women are definitely at the bottom of the hierarchy, in the sense that they are subjected to political oppression. They do suffer the same class problems that men suffer from at work or under labor circumstances or whatever. Plus, I think they also suffer the oppression of their own men, and especially in situations where there is occupation. I mean, it's a vicious circle where usually men get frustrated from their daily experiences of oppression at checkpoints, on the way to work, at work itself, and then this frustration is of course released against the women. This is on one level. On the other level, of course, there is a tradition which is more fiercely practiced against women than against men. So women don't even, in many cases, have the social outlet which enables them to release much of the frustration that they get subjected to. I mean, the fact that they're not allowed out, and in many cases they don't even work. I'm not saying that the situation is that bad. All I'm saying is that women in general are subjected to oppression that is also additional to that men are subjected to.
I'll summarize my remarks under three categories, trying to answer most of the questions. The first one has to do with observation about using English, and the question that was addressed to me about exchange, about using Palestinian identity and then Arab identity. I'm sorry?
I said it was very
no, I understand.
The minute you went into it.
No, I understand. I just wanted to say that I have been asked this question before, and I think that I use the two terms exchangeably. Arab identity completely describes Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza and Arabs in Israel, and Palestinian identity describes Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and Israel. Actually, what happened is that Palestinians in Israel at some point being called Israeli Arabs by the state and by the academia and by society, and being called the Arabs in Israel and so on, actually developed at some point what I called accentuated identity. So you would refer to you will talk to most of them, and the instant, immediate answer would be, excuse me, I'm a Palestinian, if you say Israeli Arab. So the identity was accentuated. I think Arabs in Israel now, as many people here, Danny's work and many others, their Palestinian identity is confident, stable, comfortable. And I think out of that comfort, it's that they refer to themselves as sometimes Palestinians, sometimes Arabs. This is my understanding in any case. The second remark has to do with the question about talking. I think some of the questions here. I want you to, I want to share something with you. There is a feeling that talking is worthless. I mean, what else can be said? So perhaps when one talks, like I refer to myself as talking here and before at Vanlier, as sharpening things as much as possible, the privileged and the underprivileged, the master and the slave, and so on. Talking, in this climate where the political work doing is impossible, as Danny put it. But doing is impossible not only for the Arabs in Israel. Doing is impossible internationally. Doing when the hegemonic force is the occupier in the Middle East by the United States, supporting Israel. Doing, if you look around you in the Arab world, is very much difficult to do. The Arab world is actually, well, anyway, is postponing processes of democratization in return for supporting American policy here, and in Iraq. And among Palestinians in the West Bank, and among refugees, and among Palestinians in Israel, the three segments of the Palestinian people doing is, it's very hard. So this is the climate. Doing is hard, talking is worthless, so what do you do? I think there's also the sense here about, so it's an existential crisis kind of thing among people like myself, at least. But there's also the sense, from my experience at Tel-Aviv University for 3 or 4 years and here, that you really can talk anything you want. And I often ask myself, what is it in Israeli society that people come, listen, in something of, I don't think it's very pleasant to tell you that you are the masters and we are the slaves. And you listen to that. That it's like apartheid in the West Bank, and there are features of apartheid in Israel. You listen, there's something here very interesting. I think there's something that people don't care. As long as we have the force, as long as we are controlling, as long as we are dominant, as long as we can do whatever we want, so talk, say it. And I think there's something here profound from, I'm feeling that, I think that the whole project, again, this is kind of the thing, the whole project of the Jewish state is based on force. We have to face that. It's based on force, is maintained by force, and will continue by force, and deep down, we know that, and you know that. And until that essence of force is being exchanged with Palestinians in what Salim and Danny referred to as dealing with the fear in one way or another and getting off that force in perhaps one state, whatever. But this force is remarkable. The violence is remarkable, and I think within that there is a space for say anything you want. I am the master. The third point has to do with what I find, I haven't seen Salim for a year. And I was at UCLA a month ago, and somebody told me Salim was supposed to come here to talk about one state. As Salim referred to himself, he said that I'm not a supporter, I wasn't a supporter. I'm a supporter of one state solution. I wrote about it by National State and so on a number of years ago and so on. You have to understand, the argument was that it's when Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza will internalize that two states are not possible, that one state will become the political project. How and in what format and so on will become the political project of the Palestinians. Again, this is not a threat. This is reality. Now, if you notice, Palestinians who supported one state, the elites, are from the refugees and from Palestinians in Israel. Those Palestinians in Israel who thought that two-state solution would leave them under the domination of the Jewish master. In a Jewish state that will enforce upon us that it's democratic when it's not. And the refugees that in a two-state solution will have will have no return to Palestine. The third segment of the Palestinian people that counts and makes difference is the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And I think the elites in the West Bank and Gaza who indeed wanted genuinely one-state solution, and that is the opportunity of the Israelis that was lost. We can talk about that as much as you want. Palestinians don't have a chance, they don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think Israel missed it. In Hebrew, big. And it missed it. And I think the future of the Jewish state is really dependent, inherently dependent on a viable, independent, self-respecting, dignified Palestinian state. Once that becomes impossible, the other becomes impossible, and the one-state solution will become the political program or the political vision that some program for which will have to be developed.
I first want to refer to the dangerous statement that was made by the gentleman who is no longer with us about this panel representing or reflecting democracy. I'm saying it is a dangerous statement because there is a political significance to it. It's not just an observation about an evening in Jerusalem. Nothing is symmetric, and the reason that an Israeli is not welcome, an Israeli academic in Be'ezet, has nothing to do with a culture of this or the other or democracy. It has to do with power and with resistance and with defiance, and it has to do with occupation. There is a dilemma for Palestinians, both Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, which I call the dilemma of participation in panels like this, but also in many other activities and even careers. Then the dilemma is that people want to participate, they want to have careers, they want to do well, they are in competitive or just in making a living. But sometimes, especially when participation is also publicly visible, sometimes there is the nightmare fear that by merely participating, you legitimate a system which is made out of many more intricate and more powerful and more pervasive situations than a panel in Van Leer in one afternoon. And you give it legitimation, and you actually strengthen it structurally by being there. So this is the dilemma of participation. And whenever I hear somebody looking at this participation as a sign of hope, I think that the political significance of it and the dangerous political significance should be pointed out. About the question about Islamic fundamentalism and whether what is happening probably more visibly in Gaza is likely to happen elsewhere, I think that Islamic fundamentalism, like most other fundamentalisms, has very little to do with religion. And it has very little to do with a religious revival. There's a lot of research about it in many cross-cultural contexts, not necessarily only about Islam or only about Arabs. It has to do with the ability of religion generally, as a set of values, to sometimes articulate very clearly some of the fundamental sensations and political aspirations of a group of people. Articulation for religion happens in a very natural way, and I think this is very much what is the secret of the political success of Islamic movements in a place like Palestine, which is under occupation. And I think it became particularly relevant under the militarization of the occupation and under the Palestinian Authority, in which the secular political powers in Palestinian society were seen to be complacent and to be collaborative to the new regime of the occupation. So I think that looking for the future in terms of how successful this fundamentalism or other fundamentalisms elsewhere in the world will be requires us really to look at the future of oppression, the future of class struggle, a future of poverty, and in this case, the future of being oppressed, enslaved, as Nadim puts it, by an occupying power. About the one-state solution, and I follow on both from what Salim said and what Nadim said. And I will start with a word on the term of apartheid, because the idea is really that one state already exists, even if it's not called one state with equal citizens, but the one system of control, an Israeli system of control, is already there. The only problem is that some of the people are citizens and some of the people do not have citizenship, which is the main feature of apartheid. Apartheid, when it was coined as a term in South Africa, it was significant because it was one of the few instances in modern history in which discrimination and oppression was actually articulated in law. and substantiated in an overall encompassing ideology of what is mankind, what sorts of people are there, and who are the people who live around us. Now, as I said before, the Israeli system of control has not done that. There's no articulation, certainly not by hegemonic mainstream Israel, of the situation on the ground there as being an articulated form of apartheid, which is based on, for example, racial discrimination or even ethnic or national. Some people amongst the settlers, and this was apparent in Chaim Yavin's recent series, some people make this articulation, but they are not from the mainstream and that they are not the state. And yet, in practice, we have it already. The system of permits and closures that the Palestinians have been working under since the 1990s is one of its most obvious manifestation. And I think that what we have here, which is analogous to apartheid, is that we do have structural separation, and even if it's not articulated in state ideology and in a set of rules or laws, it is inscribed in the landscape. And this sometimes can be as dangerous as a rule book or a law codex, which makes which differentiates between people. Sometimes inscribing it in the landscape, which means inscribing it on the day-to-day reality, etching it into people's consciousness of both the oppressed and the oppressor, can be as effective as creating it as a state ideology, as was the case in South Africa. I'm making all this point about apartheid because the vision of one state, which both Nadim and Salim talked about, is really not a one-state solution that comes out of political will or political decision or consensus, but something that grows out of the situation on the ground. And I agree with them that there is a very high probability that this situation on the ground will be, if not eternalized, will be set in motion for a very long time in front of us, which is why people now talk about we've missed the opportunity of two-state solution. So if following that logic, I think what we're looking at, and this is just to end on a particularly pessimistic note, is that we're looking at a vision of one state which is in fact and in practice, if not de jure, an apartheid state. And the only glimmer of hope is that even apartheid only existed for 46 years. It began in 1948 in a strong way in South Africa and was dissolved within 46 years. So maybe the transition stage of an apartheid state, which is really an Israeli system of control, but which could then evolve, hopefully painlessly, but who knows how, into a more democratic situation, is not going to be, one of hundreds or thousands of years. Maybe our grandchildren will see it.
I'd like to thank also panelists on behalf of all of us.